first, it's time for Becoming Gift with Andrew Reinhart. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning, Pat, Dave, and Ron. How are you?
Great.
Great. How are you?
Doing great. No complaints.
Good.
So today I just wanted to take a minute and talk about bodily health and stewardship. This is kind of the paragraph of the Catechism which talks about all this, 2289. It says, if morality requires respect for the life of the body, it does not make it an absolute value. It rejects a neo-pagan notion that tends to promote the cult of the body, to sacrifice everything for its sake, to idolize physical perfection and success at sports. But its selective preference of the strong over the weak, such a conception can lead to the perversion of human relationships. So this idea here from the Catechism, first, we can't ignore that first sentence. It says, if morality requires respect for the life of the body, meaning morality does require respect for the life of the body. It doesn't make it an absolute value. And for about the next month, I think I want to kind of spend some time with an idea. How do we as Catholics respect the life of the body, but not make it an absolute value, not make it an idol? And I would propose that at core of this is the Catholic idea of stewardship, which is, in my view, at base, a basic posture or relationship toward creation, towards nature, stewardship and self-possession. So we can't reduce the body to as a means to an end. We can't reduce the body as a means to an end. There's a lie that's contrary to the Catholic view of stewardship coming out of the classical idea of liberalism, that the stuff of the world is neutral and it's waiting for us to assign meaning to it. Right? That, there's all this stuff we go out and we discover, and then we can just do whatever we want with it, regardless of its ends. So we give the world around us meaning by how we use it. And think of this with our own body. If we were to apply this kind of neutral understanding of our body, we end up with this kind of transhuman ideology that's burgeoning in our society that I think Pope Leo intends to sort of confront in his papacy. So in the Catholic worldview, created things have their own meaning and dignity. So it's in an encounter with God's creation that we discover Him, His design, and more fully come to understand ourselves. Right, so in this encounter, implicit to it is a kind of vulnerability. It's a vulnerability to not just sort of do what we want with the world, but by encountering the world, we encounter a certain responsibility toward it, a certain weight of how we need to live within the space that God has given us, as opposed to us just going out and using and abusing and doing what we want. So when we think of this kind of stewardship with ourselves, we can use our body in a lot of different ways, and sometimes it's hard to figure out what that means, because there's different kinds of pleasure. Right. There's a pleasure from, just like throwing down a box of Twinkies or sleeping 24 hours or, obviously the whole realm of lust and pleasure that way. But there's another way of pleasure. Right? I can derive pleasure and use from my body by making it very, very attractive. Right. And then it can become a means to an end of maybe having a relationship with a certain kind of person, or getting a certain kind of compliment, or just sort of looking a certain way, a kind of vanity to it, right? So we can have a guise of health that's actually a thin cloak for vice. So in whatever way, if we're using our body as a means to an end, we're not truly stewarding what God has given us. So the true end for a human is to know and love. In that old Baltimore Catechism, know, love, and serve God in this life and the next, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. Well, this core idea of knowing and loving God and others, right? This is the end that we should discover when we encounter our own body, when we truly encounter ourselves as a whole human person. And this is why something like martyrdom isn't contradictory to this phrase that we do have to care and steward our body, right? Because by giving ourselves, our whole person for something in love, especially God, right, we're serving the end of the body. We're serving the end that we discover in God's creation. But in this, then, we have to sort of take this foil of, are we truly caring and discovering what God has given me in myself throughout our human action? You can almost do like an examination of conscience on it at the end of the day. Think about the way you're choosing to eat, the way you're choosing to sleep, whether or not you're choosing to exercise, even down to how you choose to dress your body up, how you clothe yourself, right? There can be, I think, a deep and rich examination of conscience about our care for our body.
And dangers.
Andrew,
go ahead, Pat. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I love that, the Catechism says it's not an absolute value. And because, as we always say, virtue is the middle ground. And prudence helps us kind of decide how to do this. And I think that's the key, isn't it? That's the key that keeps us from becoming, because I think as people get older, you start to worry about your health more. You almost obsess about your health, and so to find that middle ground, I think, is so important. Any tips on how to do that?
Yeah, well, that's really kind of what's coming up in the next weeks.
Okay.
Because what we're going to talk about is Christ being the model, taking everything through the filter of our vocation, and also having kind of a realism about our health versus an idealism about our health. And so I would say, just as kind of an initial answer, I think you're getting out of order when you're neglecting higher duties for lower ones, right? So there's a certain order of love that your life presents to you, whether it be the mission that God has given you, you living your faith, praying, going to Mass, loving the Lord, loving your spouse, your children, your family members, right? So if your sort of quote unquote health routine causes you to neglect your higher duties, you've got it out of whack.
Yeah, and we know there are dangers on both sides, right? And this is pointed to even with the fact that the church has struggled to come up with, at times, with what the balance is in our monastic lives and all that there was a call to self-infliction and all that, and maybe kind of moderated over the years. But to know that you've got to involve wisdom here to get to that healthy balance. Amen. Dangers on one side and on the other.
Amen. And historically, we would have had a lot of external boundaries on our behavior, right? It's like if there wasn't someone that made cheese in your town, you probably weren't going to be eating much cheese.
Yeah, right.
But we have this kind of quasi-limitless ability to consume in our society, right? Adam and Eve were taken out of the garden not just for a punishment, but maybe actually because of the loss of grace. It wasn't in their best interest to stay in the garden. And one of the characteristics of the garden was limitless fruit. Right? They could have got some sugar diabetes in that garden in light of original sin. Right? So Adam and Eve are taken out of this state of limitless ability to consume. And in modernity, we've kind of brought ourselves back into a quasi-garden.
Yeah.
The modern supermarket, we most Americans don't have a limit on how much we might eat or what sorts of things we might eat. So historically, I think humans flourish in a space where we're provided boundaries, where we're provided certain limits by our environment. And now that we're in a space where we're not provided those limits by our environment, we're just faced with a lot more difficulty in these areas of life.
Yeah, and look, we've had a history of some saints with great girth, like St. Thomas Aquinas, and I point that out, and somebody says to me, well, you can't use him as a model, Dave, because he was quite bright. I'm like, oh, well, never mind. At least I have something in common with him.
I would like to keep our private conversations private, Dave, if you don't mind.
That's right.
Andrew Reinhart, wonderful. Thank you.